I'm going to tell you something that happened to me 4 years ago, and I still think about it almost every single day. Not in a haunted kind of way. More like the way you think about a sunrise you saw once from a mountaintop. The kind of thing that doesn't happen to most people, and when it happens to you, you spend the rest of your life knowing that you have seen something the world mostly hasn't. My name is Ren Calloway. I was 32 years old when this happened. I was a salvage engineer, the unglamorous kind, not the kind you see in recruitment hollows where the guy has perfect teeth and a gleaming exosuit. I was the kind that wore a patched pressure suit with a coffee stain on the left chest panel, and spent most of my working hours inside the skeletal remains of dead ships, pulling out components that other people had given up on. I was good at it. I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying it because it matters to the story. The ship I worked on was called the Meridian Drift, a Terran Standard salvage hauler, 400-ton displacement, old enough to have character but not old enough to be a liability. My crew was small, 7 people total. Our captain was a woman named Sable Oren, who had the kind of voice that made you feel like whatever she said was probably right even when it wasn't. Our engineer was a man named Toss, short for Tosswick, which he hated, and he could keep an engine running with approximately a wire, a prayer, and whatever insults he had stored up from the previous week. Then there was Yina, who handled our comms and translation arrays. And there were 3 others I won't name right now because they don't appear in this part of the story much, and I don't want to get ahead of myself. We were operating in the Sulhar Drift, a debris field about 60 light minutes from a red dwarf star called Kelash Minor. The Sulhar Drift was what you got when 2 abandoned mining operations had a collision about 200 years ago, and nobody bothered to clean it up. The result was a region of space about 800,000 kilometers in diameter, full of spinning metal, dead reactor husks, pulverized asteroid material, and the occasional ghost ship that had gotten too close to the field and never made it back out. It was, honestly, one of my favorite places in the known galaxy. Not because it was beautiful, it wasn't, not conventionally, but it had that quality that very old, very broken things sometimes have, a kind of dignity, like a cathedral that had been abandoned for centuries but still had its windows. We had been working the drift for about 9 days when Toss picked something up on the passive sensor array. I remember exactly what he said. He came into the main hold, where I was cataloging a haul of power coupling modules we'd pulled from a wrecked refinery platform, and he stood in the doorway for a second before he said, "Ren, you're going to want to come look at this." That was all. When Toss said that, you went. He wasn't a dramatic person. He didn't call you over to look at something unless it was actually worth looking at. I set down the coupling I was examining and followed him up to the cockpit. Yina was already there. She was leaning over the sensor console with that focused expression she got when she was trying to make sense of something that didn't immediately make sense. Sable was in the captain's chair. She had a cup of something warm in her hands. She looked calm, but Sable always looked calm. I once saw her look calm while a coolant pipe ruptured 6 feet from her face. So calm wasn't necessarily a useful indicator with her. The sensor display showed a contact. Not a piece of debris, not a dead rock, something with internal structure, something with what appeared to be a partially intact power signature, impossibly faint, the kind of reading that most sensor arrays would have written off as background noise. But our array wasn't most sensor arrays. Toss had spent a lot of time modifying ours, and one of his modifications was a noise filtration algorithm he'd written himself, which he called, unimaginatively, the quiet filter. The quiet filter was designed to find signals that were trying very hard not to be found, or signals that had simply been broadcasting for so long, in such a degraded state, that they'd stopped trying. "How big?" I asked. "Current read is approximately 2.7 kilometers stem to stern," Toss said. "But I think that's a partial read. The debris field is eating most of the signal. I think the actual vessel could be considerably larger. Could be considerably larger, Sable said. She hadn't moved from her chair. What kind of vessel? Yina turned around. She had this look on her face, a look I hadn't seen on her in 3 years of working together. I ran the hull signature through every database we carry, she said. Terran Admiralty Registry, free colonial ships, independent operators, outer reach merchants, Kethani Trade Registry, Duruval Naval Archive, everything. She paused. No match. No match, she said. Not even close. The material composition of the hull is doing things that our database doesn't have categories for. I want to stop right here and explain something for anybody who hasn't spent much time in the salvage business. When you pull a hull signature on a ship, meaning when you bounce a sensor reading off its surface and analyze what comes back, you get what's essentially a fingerprint. Every material has a signature. Every alloy, every composite, every hull coating compound. And over the centuries that humanity has been out here in the dark, we've cataloged a lot of those signatures. Our databases include not just human-built ships, but materials from every species with which we've had sustained contact. Kethani Duruval, the Emrath Cooperative, the Sulhari Collective, which had nothing to do with this particular debris field, despite the name, the Vreni, even a partial catalog of hegemony vessels, which was constantly being updated because the hegemony was very protective of their specifications, and nobody blamed them. To say that a hull signature returned no match, no even approximate match, against all of that data, that meant one of two things. Either the ship was very old, older than records, predating the era of formal cataloging, or it was from a civilization we didn't know. Neither of those options was simple. We approached slowly. That's the first rule of salvage work when you encounter something unknown, slow and respectful, because the universe has a fine tradition of punishing people who approach things quickly. The Sulhar drift made slow travel complicated. We had to navigate through a region of rotating debris that included chunks of asteroid rock the size of small houses, and spinning panels of hull plating that could shear through our ship without much difficulty if they hit at the wrong angle. Toss was at the helm. He was a better pilot than any of us liked to admit, because acknowledging it would have inflated his ego past tolerable limits. He moved the meridian drift through the debris field with the kind of quiet confidence that looked almost lazy, until you realized how many micro-adjustments he was making every 30 seconds. It took us almost 4 hours to get close enough to see it with our optical sensors. And when we saw it, honestly, I've been trying to figure out how to describe it to people ever since, not because it was beyond description, but because descriptions always seem to flatten it, like trying to describe a piece of music by telling someone which notes it has. The ship was enormous. Not the kind of enormous you can just say and have it land correctly. It was the kind of enormous that shifted your perspective, where you looked at it, and for a moment your brain refused to accept the scale because it was outside the range of what your brain had been told was possible for a ship. It was longer than 2 kilometers, certainly. Our subsequent measurements put it at about 3.4 kilometers, though the forward section was damaged badly enough that the original length might have been considerably more. It had a shape that was not quite like anything I'd seen. Human ships tend toward either functional geometry, boxes, cylinders, utilitarian forms, or toward the aesthetic conventions of whichever species built them. Kethani ships looked like they were grown rather than built, all curved asymmetrical surfaces. Duruval ships are angular and aggressive, like someone took a diamond and kept cutting corners off it. This ship looked like it was designed by someone who thought about the movement of water. Its main hull was a long, flowing form that tapered and swelled in ways that suggested current, or wind, or some force that flows. The lateral structures, not quite wings, not quite fins, swept back in a curve that reminded me of the way a large sea creature's body creates flow lines. Everything about its design seemed to be about motion, except that right now it wasn't moving at all. It was rotating slowly. A dead rotation, the kind that happens when a ship loses attitude control and just starts to drift, and whatever small forces are in the environment begin to impart their own slow spin over years or decades or more. Around it, embedded in the debris of the drift, were what appeared to be smaller pieces of the same vessel, fragments, sheared-off sections, modules that had broken away and were now tumbling separately, caught in the gravitational dance of the surrounding material. "It's not just damaged," Yina said quietly. "It looks like it was in a battle." She was right. Now that we were close enough to see the surface detail, I could make out the marks, impact craters of the kind made by weapons fire, not collisions. Sections of hull that had been subjected to catastrophic energy discharge. Portions of the ship's lateral structures that had been cut, not broken, not bent, but cut cleanly, in ways that spoke of directed energy weapons at very high power settings. Somebody had tried very hard to destroy this ship. They had not quite succeeded. We held position about 3 kilometers out and ran every passive scan we had. Sable and I sat in the briefing alcove behind the cockpit, a generous term for a 2-meter-wide space with a fold-out table and 4 seats that were attached to the wall, and Yina walked us through what the scans were showing. "Power signature is still active," she said. "Extremely faint but active. Something is running in there. Could be a reactor in minimal maintenance mode. Could be an emergency cell array. Hard to say without getting closer." "Internal atmosphere?" Sable asked. "Patchy. Sections of the ship appear to still have intact pressure. The debris field around us is interfering with deep penetration scans, so I'm only getting reads on the outer sections. But there are pressurized compartments." "Biological," Sable said. The word sat in the room for a moment. Yina's expression was careful. "The deep scan resolution isn't good enough to say definitively, but I'm getting thermal variations in some of the pressurized sections that could be consistent with biological activity." Sable looked at me. I looked at her. "Could be automated systems," I said. "Emergency protocols. Life support maintaining pressure and temperature, even with nobody home." "Could be," Yina said. "But—" She shrugged, and it was the most elaborate shrug I had ever seen. "But the thermal variations are irregular. Automated systems tend to be consistent. Irregular variations are more characteristic of something alive," I finished. Nobody spoke for a little while. What followed was the argument I expected us to have, which was the argument that basically every salvage crew has when they find something like this. The Outer Reach salvage codes, the body of law that governs what people like us can and can't do, are pretty clear on one point. A vessel with living occupants is not a salvage vessel. You cannot legally claim it, strip it, or remove its components without consent. The implication being, if someone is alive in there, this is a rescue operation, not a salvage operation. The other implication being, rescue operations are not profitable. Toss made this point. He made it carefully and without being callous about it, but he made it, because he was the one who handled our finances, and he knew exactly what we were burning through to sit here in this debris field. "I'm not saying we leave without knowing," he said. "I'm saying we need to think about what we're getting into." "We know what we're getting into," Sable said. "We're getting into a 3-kilometer alien ship of unknown origin that has been sitting in a debris field for an indeterminate period of time, that appears to have survived a weapons engagement, and that may or may not have living occupants. Yes, that's what we're getting into. So we should be honest about the risk." "I'm always honest about the risk." You're always calm about the risk, Toss said. That's different. She almost smiled at that. We do a close approach, hull contact, external inspection. If we confirm the biological signatures, we attempt contact. If we can't make contact and can establish that the ship is truly abandoned, we file a claim and proceed with standard salvage protocol. And if we make contact, then we handle it. Toss considered this for a moment, then nodded. That was how it went. That was how most decisions went on the Meridian Drift. Sable laid out the plan, Toss raised the objection. They reached an accommodation. It worked. We suited up. Sable and I were going EVA, extravehicular activity, the formal term for going outside into the nothing and hoping your suit held together. We wore our best suits, full pressure armor with integrated sensor arrays, comms that were heavily encrypted by default, and maneuvering thrusters that Toss had maintained personally. The walk through the debris field was something I'll never forget. Toss maneuvered the Meridian Drift to within about 200 meters of the alien hull, and then Sable and I went out. Moving through that debris field was like moving through a very slow storm. Chunks of rock and metal turned around us in their long, patient rotations. We used our thrusters carefully, threading through the gaps, watching the positions of everything. Nothing was moving fast, but nothing was still either. As we got closer to the alien hull, the scale of it became real in a way that sensor data hadn't been able to communicate. We were approaching a wall, not a surface, a wall, smooth in sections, torn open in others. The material of the hull had a quality I hadn't seen before. It wasn't metallic in the conventional sense. It had a sheen to it that shifted slightly as you moved relative to it, the way the surface of very still water shifts when you change your viewing angle. Under our suit lights, it picked up color in a way that reminded me of an oil film, that faint iridescence, except that the underlying surface was dark, almost black. You seeing this? Sable's voice in my earpiece was quiet, the way voices get when a person is genuinely awed. I'm seeing it, I said. Material science people are going to lose their minds. Yeah. We moved along the hull surface, our boots making occasional magnetic contact when we found sections that had enough ferromagnetic composition to hold us. Many sections didn't. This hull wasn't built with human boots in mind. I was running my own sensor array, the handheld unit I carried, which was better than the ship's sensors at close range, and feeding readings back to Yina aboard the Meridian Drift. Thermal signature is stronger out here, I reported, getting distinct warm patches through the hull. Yina, you're seeing this. I see it, she said. Ren, those warm patches are clustered, not distributed. Something in there is generating localized heat in specific areas. Biological, or very complex automated systems. The distribution pattern is, she paused. It's honestly more consistent with biological. I moved toward the strongest thermal cluster. It was about 60 meters ahead of me, in a section of the hull that had some damage impact marks. The surface warped and partially buckled, but was otherwise intact. I put my gloved hand on the hull. And then I felt something I was not expecting to feel. A vibration. Faint, almost below the threshold of perception, but there, running through the hull material like a very distant heartbeat, irregular, slow. I pressed harder. The vibration changed. It quickened slightly, as if in response. Sable, I said. I felt it too, she said. She was 2 meters to my left and she had her hand on the hull as well. Yina, we are getting hull vibration at this location. It is responsive to external stimulus. Please log this. Timestamp. Already logged, Yina said, and Sable. I have a stronger thermal read now. Whatever is in there just got warmer. There are protocols for this kind of thing. First contact protocols. They're written assuming that you're in a properly equipped vessel with diplomacy-rated communication arrays, and a full translation library, and at least 3 people on board who have done the mandatory first contact training that the Terran Outer Reach Authority makes mandatory for any ship operating beyond the frontier markers. We had Yina, who had done the training. We had a translation array that was adequate for the 6 species we regularly interacted with and approximately inadequate for an unknown species. We had the goodwill and the clear consciences that came from being, I would like to think, basically decent people. That had to be enough, because it was what we had. We retreated to the ship. We suited down. We had a brief, intense conversation about how to proceed. What we decided was this: we would try to find a way into the ship, not to take anything, to make contact. If there was something alive in there, it had been in that debris field for an unknown period of time, in a wrecked ship, in what was clearly a post-battle situation, and it needed help. That was not a complicated moral equation. Part 2, Inside the Dark. Finding a way in took 6 hours. The ship did not have any access points that we recognized as access points. No hatches with standard Galactic Compact compliant interface panels. No docking collars in any configuration we'd seen before. No airlocks built to any specification in our database. What it had, we eventually realized, were sections of hull that responded to particular types of contact. I found the first one by accident. I was moving along the hull with my sensor unit, doing a systematic scan, when I put my hand down on a section of the surface that was slightly different in texture from the surrounding area, smoother, with a faintly geometric quality to its surface, the way certain materials look when they've been tooled rather than grown or cast. When I pressed it with a specific amount of force, not light contact, not hard contact, but something in between, something that felt like a deliberate touch rather than a casual one, the section of hull shifted. Not dramatically, not like a door flying open. More like something releasing, a slight give in the surface, a change in the vibration running through it. Then slowly, a section of hull about 2 meters tall and 1 meter wide began to move. It didn't slide. It didn't swing open. It did something more complex. It seemed to recede inward and then to the side, the material moving in a way that I could not entirely follow with my eyes, as if it was changing its configuration rather than simply moving its position. What was left was an opening. Dark inside, no light we could see. Air, Yina's sensors confirmed it when we pushed a probe in. Internal atmosphere, pressure slightly higher than the comfortable range for humans but not dangerous. Composition we weren't entirely sure about, which was why we kept our suits on. We went in. Inside the ship, the scale was different from what I'd expected. Human ships of equivalent external dimensions tend to have a certain internal logic, large open spaces for cargo or mechanical systems, narrower corridors for crew movement, compact compartments for quarters and operations. The engineering logic of human ship design is fairly consistent because it's built around the human body, which has specific dimensions and specific needs. This ship's interior was not built around anything I could identify. The corridors, if that's even the right word, were wide and curved, not in a decorative way, but in a structural way, as if the designers had conceived of internal space as something that should flow rather than something that should be divided. The ceilings were high. The floors were not flat. They had a gentle curvature that I could barely detect visually, but that my proprioception noticed, a slight constant sense of being on a slope that wasn't quite a slope. The walls had that same iridescent quality as the exterior hull, but in here, some of them were lit. Not with any visible light source. The illumination seemed to come from within the material itself, a faint ambient glow that pulsed very slowly, almost like breathing. "Those are power conduits," I said, studying one of the walls, "or something analogous to them. The luminescence is probably a function of power flow, less flow, dimmer light." The ship is running on almost nothing, Sable said, just barely keeping the minimum alive. We moved deeper. Yina was in our earpieces constantly, pulling our sensor feeds and trying to cross-reference everything she could. She was running a dedicated recording on every feed. Whatever we saw, she was cataloging. That was professionalism, but it was also, I knew Yina well enough to know this, excitement. She was excited in the same way I was, underneath all the caution. The biological thermal signatures were deeper in the ship. Further aft, toward what appeared to be the central mass of the vessel, where the damage from the exterior battle was less severe. We found the first body 40 minutes in. I'm going to tell this part carefully, because I want to get it right. The corridor we were moving through opened into a larger space, a chamber of some kind, oval in cross-section, about 30 meters across and perhaps 40 meters long. The ceiling was high enough that our suit lights couldn't fully illuminate it. There were structures in the room that I couldn't immediately classify. They were somewhere between furniture and equipment, organic in form, dark and still. Along the far wall were what I can only describe as recesses, curved indentations in the wall surface, each one roughly the size and shape of a large person. Each recess had a covering, the same material as the hull, translucent in the low light, sealed. In most of the recesses, there was a figure. Humanoid roughly, not human. Taller than I was, I'd estimate around 2 to 2.2 meters when standing. The silhouette was bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical, with limbs in roughly analogous positions to human limbs, but the proportions were different. The head was broader and appeared to have secondary structural elements above the main skull form. The hands, if hands is the right word, had more fingers than a human hand, and the arrangement was different. The figures were still, completely still. In most of the recesses, the figures appeared through the translucent covers to show no thermal signature at all. Cold. Sable and I did not speak to each other for a long time. We walked the length of the chamber looking at each recess, counting. There were 32 of them in this room alone. 30 of them were cold. 2 were not. The 2 recesses with thermal signatures were at the far end of the chamber, separated from the others by a few meters. The covering material over these 2 was different, slightly darker, slightly more opaque, and it was vibrating with a rhythm I was beginning to recognize. The same slow, irregular pulse I'd felt through the hull. Heartbeats, or what passed for heartbeats in whatever physiology these beings had. We stood in front of them for a while. They're alive, Sable said. Yes. In some kind of stasis, suspension. Maybe, or something functionally similar. I studied the covering material. The ship is barely running. If these are stasis fields, they're running on minimal power. If the power fails entirely, they die, she said. Unless the suspension itself somehow sustains them. But if it worked that way, why would they need power at all? She turned to look at me. We need to stabilize the ship's power before we do anything else. This was the moment when the salvage mission became something different. Finding the ship's power systems was not straightforward. The ship's engineering spaces were, like everything else, in a configuration that had no direct analog to anything we'd worked on before. We spent 3 hours just trying to understand the layout. Yina was invaluable here. She was methodical in a way that I sometimes wasn't, and she had studied xenoarchitectural theory as part of her comms training, which gave her a framework for thinking about how non-human systems were organized. Start with the flow, she kept saying over comms. Everything flows somewhere. Power, atmosphere, coolant, data. If you follow the flows, you find the systems. She was right. It took time, but it worked. The power system, when we found it, was elegant in a way that I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't based on any technology I recognized precisely, but the principles were translatable. You could see what it was trying to do even when you couldn't entirely see how it was doing it. There were primary generation units, 3 of them, two of which were completely dead, one of which was running at a fraction of its capacity. There were distribution systems, managing the trickle of power that remained and routing it to priority functions. There were storage systems, fully depleted. And there was an interface. I stood in front of the interface for a long time. It was not designed for human hands or human sensory systems. It was built for something with more fingers, probably better spatial reasoning in 3 dimensions, and possibly sensory capabilities we don't have. But it was an interface. There were inputs. There were what appeared to be status displays. There were controls. And I am an engineer. I am an engineer who has spent 15 years working on the mechanical and electronic systems of ships built by 6 different species, who has rebuilt power couplings by feel in the dark while depressurized, who once rerouted a Kethani atmospheric system using nothing but pattern recognition and stubbornness. I looked at that alien interface and I thought, I can figure this out. Not all of it, not quickly, but enough. This is the part of the story that people always want me to rush through when I tell it, because they want to get to the moment when things happen dramatically. But I think the slow part is actually the most important part, because it's the part that shows what engineering actually is. Engineering is not the dramatic moment when you throw the switch and the lights come on. Engineering is the 4 hours before that when you are sitting on the floor of an alien ship, sketching what you see in a worn notebook, building a vocabulary for a system in a language you don't speak. I found the power distribution interfaces. I learned what I could touch and what I should not touch. I made mistakes, small ones, fortunately, the kind that caused minor anomalous readings rather than catastrophic failures. I corrected them. I found the secondary distribution pathways that were routing power around damaged primary conduits. I found the failsafes that the ship had engaged automatically, limiting power draw to critical systems to preserve what little remained. And I found the storage units. The storage units were depleted, but they were not damaged. They were functional. They could accept charge. The question was where the charge would come from. I went back to the Meridian Drift. You want to give our power to the alien ship, Toss said. Some of it a controlled transfer. Enough to stabilize the stasis systems and keep those 2 signatures alive. He was quiet for a moment, doing math in his head. We carry enough reserve to do that and still maintain ship operations, he said. But we'd be in a conserved operating mode. No heavy systems, nothing external. I know. We'd also be effectively anchored here until we could recharge our own reserves, which with our collection arrays at current efficiency. 12 to 14 hours, I said. I already ran the numbers. He looked at me for a long moment. He had a face that was very hard to read, Toss did. Years of careful neutrality. But I could see, under all that careful neutrality, something that I think was the same thing I was feeling, which was the quiet certainty that there was no other option. 12 to 14 hours in the Sulhar Drift, he said, with a partially compromised crew on an alien vessel. Yes. All right, he said. The power transfer took 4 hours to complete. We ran a physical coupling between the Meridian Drift and the alien hull, a direct feed, improvised, using our own EV power umbilicals and a set of interface adapters that Toss and I built from components in our kit. The adapters were not elegant. They were, in fact, objectively an embarrassment from an engineering standpoint. But they worked, which is always the only thing that ultimately matters. As the power flowed, I watched the alien ship systems respond. It was slow at first, tentative, like watching something cold begin to warm. The luminescence in the walls deepened slightly, the pulse of the conduits becoming more regular, more confident. Secondary systems that had been shut down began to draw trickle charges, running basic self-diagnostic functions. The stasis fields around the 2 surviving figures stabilized. Their thermal signatures strengthened. I watched the readings and felt something I could not quite name. Relief was part of it, but it was more than relief. It was the feeling of doing something that mattered, really, fundamentally mattered, in a way that most of what we did day to day didn't quite reach. I had kept something alive. I had kept something alive that would have been dead in another few hours if we hadn't found it. That's a feeling I will carry for the rest of my life. Part 3. Waking. We set a watch rotation and waited. The stasis fields, now that they were stable, showed a process underway. Not immediately, not dramatically, but over the following 8 hours, the readings from the 2 occupied recesses changed in ways that Yina and I monitored carefully, trying to interpret what we were seeing. "The suspension is releasing," Yina said. She was on board the Meridian Drift, managing our sensor feeds and the power transfer monitoring. "Whatever holds them in stasis, the field is reducing. Slowly. Physiological activity is increasing." "Like warming up," I said. "Exactly like warming up. Ren, we should have the translation array ready. Whatever they are when they wake up, they're going to have questions." "So are we." I was in the chamber when it happened. I had been sitting on the floor. There was nowhere obviously designed to sit, and the floor curvature meant that sitting on it was comfortable in an unexpected way, the curve fitting naturally against a human spine, and I was writing in my notebook. I kept paper notebooks. People teased me about it. "Paper doesn't fail when your electronics fail," I always said. "Paper doesn't need power." I was writing notes on everything I'd observed about the ship's engineering system when I heard a sound. Not loud, not sudden. A sound like something shifting, like the sound that very cold water makes when you drop something warm into it. A small, soft, crystalline noise, as if a surface was releasing. I looked up. The covering over one of the 2 recesses was opening. She was tall. That's the first thing I registered, when the figure in the recess became visible. Taller than me by a significant amount, and I'm not short. The proportions were different from human proportions in several specific ways, longer in the limb, with a torso that was more elongated, and a neck that was longer than a human neck, which gave the head a slightly elevated position relative to the body that gave an impression of authority, that's the word. Even prone, even just waking, she had an impression of authority that was built into her physical form. Her skin, the only word I have for the surface of her body, was a deep blue-gray that shifted toward something warmer at the extremities. The secondary structures I'd noticed on the skull from outside were more visible now. They were crests, I thought. Bony or cartilaginous structures that ran along the upper edge of the head, and which I would later learn were a significant element of how her species communicated non-verbal cues. When she was calm, they lay flat. When she was alarmed, they rose. She was, in this first moment, neither calm nor alarmed. She was looking at the ceiling. Her eyes, which were large relative to her face, a feature common in species that evolved in lower light environments, were open. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the ceiling above her recess with a distant focus, the way people look when they are first waking from a deep sleep and haven't yet connected to where they are or what year it is. Then she turned her head, and she saw me. I had a standing position already in my mind for this moment, though I hadn't consciously planned it. I had put down my notebook. I had both hands visible, palms forward, held at about shoulder height. The universal position across almost every species we'd encountered, for I am not holding a weapon. I am not threatening you. I mean you no harm. She looked at me for what felt like a very long time. The crests on her head rose slightly. Then slowly they settled. She began to move, carefully, weakly, the way someone moves after a long time of not moving. She brought herself upright in the recess. The movement was clearly an effort. She was drawing on reserves that weren't fully replenished. She spoke. I had the translation array running. The handheld unit Yina had configured for maximum capture and minimum assumption, meaning that it was recording everything, and Yina's best translation software was working on it, but I should not expect immediate results. The unit would get better over time as it built up a dataset of the language. I did not understand what she said. She looked at my incomprehension and did something I did not expect. She tried again. In a different language. I knew Duruval, I knew some Kethani, I knew a smattering of Vreni trade pidgin. This was none of those, but it was different from what she'd said before. She had assessed my incomprehension and tried a different direction. She was thinking. Even this exhausted, even this disoriented, she was actively problem-solving. I pointed to myself. "Ren," I said. She looked at the gesture. She looked at my face. She seemed to understand the intent, "This is my name," even if she couldn't understand the sounds. She pointed to herself. She said something. I said it back as closely as I could manage. She tilted her head slightly. The crests moved. Something that might have been amusement, or might have been correction. She said it again, more slowly. I tried again. This went on for a while. Her name, as best as the translation array could eventually render it after we had built up more linguistic data, was something that sounded approximately like Kareth. I asked her, through the translation array weeks later, when we had enough of a shared framework to ask such questions, whether that was her personal name or a title, and the answer, as nearly as I could understand it, was that the distinction was not meaningful in her language in the same way it was in mine. Who she was and what she was could not be separated cleanly. In those first hours, we communicated mostly through gesture and demonstration and expression, with occasional attempts at phonetic mimicry that were equally imprecise on both sides. What I understood from those first hours. She was looking for her crew. That was the overwhelming priority. She was asking me, insisting, with a physicality that made her meaning clear even without words, whether there were others, whether they were alive. I led her to the other surviving recess first. The second figure was still in suspension, the field not yet sufficiently reduced to trigger waking. I showed her the readings on my handheld unit. She looked at them for a long time, with an expression I couldn't fully read but that felt like relief crossed with grief, as if she was glad for one alive thing in a context that contained many dead things. Then she asked to see the others. The cold recesses. I led her to them. I stood next to her in that chamber, next to the 30 cold recesses with their 30 still figures, and I watched her move from one to the next. She was still moving with difficulty. She was still weak, but she moved through that room with a steadiness that was not the steadiness of someone who was doing well. It was the steadiness of a person doing something necessary that they have already steeled themselves for. She touched the covering of each recess, her hand on the translucent surface. A moment of stillness, then to the next. All 30, she touched all 30. I stood back and let her do it. When she finished, she stood in the center of the chamber for a moment with her head slightly bowed. The crests on her head were flattened completely. I would come to learn that full flat crests in her species indicated profound sorrow. I did not say anything. There was nothing to say. She didn't need translation in that moment. She needed what any person needs in that moment, which is to not be alone, and which I could provide simply by being there. After a while she straightened. She looked at me and she said something. The translation array had been running this whole time, and it had been building, and Yina's software had been working. It rendered the phrase as, "Why are you here?" Not unkind, not accusatory, genuinely, straightforwardly asking. I said as clearly as I could, "We found your ship, we gave it power, you were dying." The array worked on it. The rendering that came back was imperfect. I could see from her expression that the meaning was only partially landing. But some of it was landing. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said something that the array rendered imperfectly. It always flagged these early renderings as low confidence, as, "You used your power, your ship's power, for mine." "Yes," I said. Something moved through her expression. I couldn't name it precisely, not then, but it was not nothing. Part 4. What she told us. Over the next several days, we stayed. We had not planned to stay. The initial plan had been a 12 to 14-hour recharge cycle, and then a decision about how to proceed. But things happened quickly after Kareth woke. The second survivor woke about 6 hours later, and he was injured, and that changed the calculus. Kareth needed time to assess the state of her ship. We needed time to understand what we had found. And all of us, I think, needed time to get to know each other well enough to make any decisions. The translation array improved dramatically over those days. Yina was brilliant at running it. She had a background in linguistics that she never talked about, but that showed clearly in how she worked with the software, finding shortcuts and heuristics that cut weeks off the standard build-up timeline. By the end of day 3, we could have something resembling a conversation. By day 5, we could have a real one. This is what Kareth told us, over several long conversations that I have been reconstructing from my notes ever since. Her people were called, and I'll use the translation array's rendering because it's the best I have, the Velanthi. They were an old species, not ancient in the way some species in the galaxy are ancient, but old by any measure that would be meaningful to a human. They had been a spacefaring civilization for roughly 12,000 years. That is a number that takes a moment to sit with. Human civilization, in the broad sense, is perhaps 10,000 years old. Human spaceflight is less than 1,000 years old. In the context of galactic history, we are new, very new. The Velanthi were not new. They had a territory. I use the word loosely, because they didn't think about space the way we tend to think about territory. That was several hundred light years across, in a region of the galaxy that did not overlap with the area where humanity had established itself. They were, as far as I could tell, completely unknown to us. They were also, as far as I could tell from Kareth, not part of any of the major galactic diplomatic frameworks that humanity had joined or known about. They were not reclusive, they traveled, they traded, they maintained relationships with other species. They were simply not close enough to us, geographically, for our paths to have crossed. Until apparently now. What the ship was doing in the Sulhar Drift, which was, to be precise, nowhere near Velanthi space, was something that Kareth explained with a care and a precision that told me it was painful. They had been fleeing. She described a conflict that I could only partially understand. Not because the translation was insufficient, but because the political and historical context was so far outside my frame of reference that I was essentially hearing the details of a war I knew nothing about in a language I was still learning. But the bones of it were comprehensible. The Velanthi had come into conflict with another species. A species that Kareth referred to in a way that the translation array had difficulty with. The rendering shifted between several options, settling eventually on something like the unforgiving, which Yina and I agreed was probably a translation of a Velanthi cultural epithet rather than the species' actual name. The conflict had not gone well for the Velanthi, at least not in the immediate period that Kareth was describing. The ship we were on, her ship, was not a military vessel. It was something more like a diplomatic and cultural preservation vessel. She was, and this was where the translation got complicated, and where I am least confident in my interpretation, something like a senior officer or an elder or a holder of institutional memory, in a way that combined all three roles. She was responsible for carrying certain information, certain artifacts, certain people who carried certain knowledge to safety. The 30 figures in the cold recesses had been her crew and her passengers. They had been caught by the unforgiving in a sector they should have been able to pass through safely. The battle had lasted about 2 hours. She was the one who had guided the ship into the Sulhar Drift, because the debris field's density made it difficult for the Unforgiving's targeting systems to maintain lock. She had bought them time, but not enough time, and not without cost. She had made the decision to put everyone into suspension and reduce all active systems to near zero, on the theory that a nearly dead ship in a debris field would be invisible. She had been right. She had also not had the power to sustain the suspension fields indefinitely. She had calculated that they had about 20 years of power remaining when they went under. She did not know how long they had been in the drift. I told her what I could infer, probably somewhere between 60 and 120 years, based on the corrosion patterns and the drift dynamics of the debris field around the ship. The power they had was nearly gone. If I had to guess, and I said this carefully, and watched the translation array do its best with the words, they had been in suspension for close to 100 years, and had maybe 2 to 3 more months of power before the fields failed entirely. She took this information with the absolute stillness of someone who has already mentally prepared for a very wide range of bad news. Then she asked me, "Are the Unforgiving still out there?" I said I didn't know, I'd never heard of them. She said, "That could mean they are gone, or it could mean they are in a part of the galaxy your people have not reached yet." I said, "Both of those things are possible." She said, "Yes. Here is something I want to note, because I think it is important." In the first several days after Kareth woke, she never asked us to help her. She answered our questions. She told us her story when we asked. She cooperated with us as we worked to understand the ship's systems and continued stabilizing its power supply. But she never asked us for help. I thought about this, and I eventually asked her about it. We were in the engineering spaces of her ship. I had been spending hours there every day, and she had begun joining me, watching what I was doing, occasionally pointing something out or correcting an assumption I was making. I said, "You've never asked us to help you. Why?" She thought about the question for a while, which was one of the things I had come to appreciate about her. She thought before she spoke. It wasn't hesitation. It was consideration. She said, "I do not know your people well enough to know the cost of a request. What you ask for, others expect to receive in return. I do not know what return would be fair." "We're not asking for a return," I said. She tilted her head. "You are not merchants. We're salvagers. We find abandoned ships and salvage their components. We found your ship and thought it was abandoned. When we discovered it wasn't, we stayed to help." "Why?" "Because someone was alive in there and needed help." She looked at me for a while. "This is the second time you have said something like this," she said, "as if it requires no further explanation." "It doesn't," I said, "not for us. It is not so simple for all species," she said. "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "Your people are young," she said. "I mean this without disrespect. You have been among the stars for a short time. You have not yet had the experiences that make some species cautious about helping strangers." "Some would say we're naive," I said. "Some would say that," she agreed. "Others would say you are something worth protecting."